Maice. I am the CTO of the Archon division at ID Technologies, and this afternoon we're going to talk a little bit about using CSfC solutions to enable unique workforces. And really when I say unique workforces, what I'm going to talk about is how do we enable the enterprise and kind of the concept of a CSfC-enabled unified network moving forward in a kind of a post-COVID, post-pandemic environment. So what we're going to do today, as far as today, we're going to kind of go through this process. We'll start off, I'll give a quick description of the CSfC program by the NSA, just to kind of help level set the group. And we'll talk a little bit about why pre-COVID you didn't see kind of CSfC deployed at an enterprise scale as well. And then we'll talk about what has to happen in order for CSfC to truly scale to an enterprise level. When I'm talking enterprise, I'm not talking 50, 100 users. I'm trying to talk into the thousands and 10,000s of users potentially, and some of the things that we'd expect to see in those environments. And finally, after that, I'm going to pivot a little bit and kind of talk about what I think is the next kind of progression of CSfC with regards to not only the Department of Defense, but the federal government as a whole. And then, we'll talk about kind of what that could look like from a kind of a unified network standpoint. So what is CSfC? Obviously on the slide deck here, there's a bunch of words. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence. But to frame it in essentially one sentence, the NSA CSfC program is about using commercial technology to protect classified data, whether in transit or at rest. Through that process, they created what they call capabilities packages, and those capability packages essentially outline a list of technologies and a list of problems that you can use CSfC to help enable. This is a list of some of the main capability packages that exist. I'm not going to talk about each and every one of them today. I'm really going to focus a lot, or quite a bit, on the mobile access CP, and I'll touch on the DAR CP a little bit as well. But if there are questions around any of this technology, or how to make it work together, or how you can use it potentially to solve some of your problems, come chat with me later. Swing by our booth. I'm more than willing to talk through this. But the mobile access CP was written with the idea of how do you enable kind of remote work, right? Whether it be phones, laptops, tablets, whatever the case may be, is how do you get mobile users, remote users, access to classified information without them always having to drive back to a SCIF, as an example, just to get connectivity. The data at rest CP is about how do I protect the data on that mobile client, right? So in the event that it does get misplaced, something along those lines, in that off state, how can we guarantee that that data is protected in a quote unquote unclassified state as well. With regards to the rest of them, just kind of quick high level, the campus wireless LAN CP is really about deploying wireless infrastructure across your campus and carrying multiple enclaves across the top of it. And then the multi-site connectivity is really centered around type 1 replacement. How do we remove the traditional kind of type 1 encryption devices out of the infrastructure and let industry kind of do what they do best with regards to innovation? And then the tactical CP, which is out in draft right now, centered around how do we enable inter and intra-squad communications using, again, commercial technologies. So we talked a little bit before about kind of what the enterprise means and about this idea of having CSfC for the thousands and 10,000s of users. And one of the questions we get asked a lot of times is why hasn't this been done yet? And really the genesis of this comes down to kind of these three core kind of concepts here. And the first one's really centered around complexity. To deploy CSfC at scale, it's hard, right? And it's hard in part because the NSA's job when they wrote these capability packages wasn't centered around making your life as the network engineer easy. It was around ensuring that that data was protected to the appropriate levels. So they implemented things such as vendor diversity, separation of duties, and put a lot of challenges on groups that were trying to field this. That also not only made it challenging from a manpower standpoint, but it also made it the barrier entry into the space pretty difficult at the beginning. The other piece of this is, unlike your kind of traditional kind of RMF where you're recertifying your ATO hopefully every 3 years, as part of the NSA registration process, you have to re-register every year, right? So you need some type of framework to allow you to accelerate that process so that you don't get hung up and have to shut down your system potentially in the middle of kind of a deployed use case. One of the other big challenges is scalability. When you start talking about thousands of users and trying to do this for something like enterprise IT, The nature of CSfC was that you were kind of compiling components together off of a list. Well, what didn't exist at the time was capabilities to do certain things, such as over-the-air updates of the entire stack, not just one component, not just potentially one virtual machine running on a box, not just one phone, but how do I actually do over-the-air updates, certificate rekeying, those type of things across an infrastructure of thousands of devices that are distributed potentially all over the country. And then finally, there's always the behavior guy, and COVID's helped with this a little bit, but there's always that one guy in the room that's like, hey, look, if you need access to classified information, you can drive your tail to work and go into the SCIF, right? You don't need to do this remotely. And obviously, when COVID happened, this changed pretty quickly. So what makes the enterprise different, right? Why is the enterprise different at the thousands of users than it is, again, at the 50s and the hundreds? And it centers around that as somebody that's administering an enterprise, you have certain expectations of tools and resources that are there to help you manage this environment. So one of the key pieces to this, and what hadn't been done prior to what we began doing, was a lot of the solutions out there were products that were already positioned in the commercial market or in the government market that then we were trying to turn and use in these very specific use cases. So what we did is we said, hey, look, the NSA gave us the answers to this question, right? They wrote the capabilities, they told you everything that every piece of equipment had to do. All somebody needed to do was go build something to do that. And I'm not going to make this a product brief. If you're interested, we can talk about it in more detail. But what I do want to talk about here is kind of the three core tenets on the bottom here, which kind of centers how we design and how we've done not only our large-scale deployments, but what trickled down into the smaller part. And we'll start off with this idea of provisioning around mobile access. We talk to customers sometimes that have built in-house mobile access solutions on like a laptop, and you'll ask them, hey, how long does it take you to provision each laptop? And I've heard numbers that start at 2 hours and go as far to 24 hours per laptop. And again, we talk about this in the thousands of users. 24 hours times 10,000 is a lot of time, a lot of resources, and it's some guy that you're probably, or guy or girl that you're paying to do this that could be doing other enterprise IT functions for the enterprise. So what we did is we said, hey, look, there's got to be a better way to do this, and we began this process at the factory. So when we developed what we call Archon OS, which is the underlying operating system for our mobile clients, we did it in a way that we could separate what makes the system fundamentally classified and sensitive and what can be done essentially at the warehouse prior to even shipping to the customer. So we began this by what happens now, at least from our standpoint, is when we ship you something like an Archon ZV client or an Archon mobile client, it shows up to you 75% provisioned already. The fundamental operating system's there, the secure VMs are fundamentally deployed across the top of it. And then once you receive it through the provisioning server process, what we've done is we've completely automated and orchestrated that process. So you plug it in, you type a web address in, and it provisions and finishes provisioning in about 15 minutes. And it takes, from the time you open that box to the time you're capable of giving it to a user, is a 15-minute gap, assuming someone's working on it kind of in that role. The other piece to this is you don't have to do it one at a time. You can do this in parallel. Right? So if you need to do 10, 15, 20 laptops at a time, whatever the case may be, you have the capability to do that through this automated provisioning process. I think that's it on that one. With regards to kind of enterprise IT management, and this is where, in my opinion, you start to see real differentiators. One of the examples we always talk about is the NSA, as part of the mobile access CP, requires you to rekey every end user device every 12 months. When you talk to most people, the way that's done currently is they take the laptop, they walk back to the help desk, or they ship it back to the help desk in the case of some of our customers, and then the help desk does it, and then they have to come back and get it, and they lose access to that machine sometimes for a couple days, or God willing, even longer, unfortunately. So in order to do this for the tens of thousands of users, there needs to be a tool that exists that allows you to do over-the-air rekeying, perform updates on the on the machines, on the appliances in the network, security patching, all of those capabilities without ever having to bring that machine or that phone or whatever the case may be back to home station. Also with that, because these are classified systems, in the event a system gets lost, the ability to remote wipe that system is critical to being able to do this, right? When you want to enable mobility, you have to protect the data that's there, and remote wipe is a critical piece of that. And then finally to this is, it shouldn't take a user to do this, right? This is a function that should happen automatically behind the scenes, that senior leadership and people using these systems don't have to worry about any of this. It just kind of happens in the background, right? No user on the network today sits there and goes, man, I really need to make sure I go to WSUS today and update my Windows box, right? It just happens kind of in the background based off, hopefully it happens in the background based off of kind of your network shop and kind of how they're running things. And the final piece of this is, one of the big challenges in this space has just been this idea of time to value, right? How do you build out an enterprise architecture and get that fielded to customers in a way that they can actually use it within a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, not a year, right? And for years, at least in my experience in the space, what you see is a customer kind of comes to a trusted integrator and goes, hey, I got this problem to solve, help me. And they kind of piece it together on an individual level every single time for customers, a little bit differently every single time based on their requirements. So what we posed back to the NSA's PMO office is we said, hey, look, let's put a standards approach in this and develop something that's a reference architecture, that's modular in nature, that allows us to kind of predict ahead of time, what are the controls, what are your deviations going to be, what are those things that are going to prevent you from getting this fielded in a timely manner to your customers. The other piece to this is everything that we build with regards to backend infrastructure, we build it out of the gate to include the enterprise gray annex. And the major reason for that is when a customer comes to us and goes, hey, I need to solve, remote workforce problems, I need to get laptops in all my employees' hands. And we're like, great, let's do it. Usually a few months later, they come back and go, yeah, can we get tablets? Can we get phones? Hey, we're going to stand up a new building. Can we do a multi-site package? And if you didn't architect your backend infrastructure with the enterprise gray annex from the get-go, the first part of that process is transitioning your backend infrastructure to support the enterprise gray annex, right? So what we decided to do from the get-go was, if we're going to do this for the enterprise, we know it's going to continue to iterate because that's the nature of the enterprise. So we pushed that in and deployed that from the Git on the box. The other piece to this too is we didn't want to pigeonhole people through this kind of architecture into a certain solution. So I mentioned before we talked about it being modular. And through that modularity, it allows us to go, hey, you need us to build black, gray, red, and mobility. We can do that in a modular sense. And if you want to bolt on phones as an example later, that's just a new module that we put onto the infrastructure that's already in place and allows us to, again, accelerate and get capabilities into customers' hands. So what do we think the future of CSfC starts to look like? And in full disclosure here, this is the future from Maice's eyes. This isn't me regurgitating something somebody else has said. This is just what I believe. And one of the things I would love to hear following this is feedback around some of these type of concepts, right? And the first one, I think, to truly get adoption of CSfC across the entire force is there has to be some concept of a global gray infrastructure. And by global gray, what I'm saying here is somebody from the enterprise level needs to deploy a gray network that can function in a multi-vendor, kind of multi-tenant capability. Meaning, if I am, say, 82nd Airborne, and I want to put a red CSfC-enabled network somewhere, the way it's done today is every single time you do this, you have to build a separate gray network and then another red network just to deploy it. Why isn't there a service provider capability out there that exists at gray where you can absorb the controls from them and then connect your red infrastructure directly to it, and then using the back end of the path, enable your mobility, multi-site, whatever the case may be for your requirement is, to solve those type of problems. One of the big things too is this can get expensive. Everybody has typically a black network and a red network, but most users don't have that gray network. It has to be built from scratch every time. And that's a cost that organization has to absorb that's very rarely typically budgeted for from the front of the jump. NSA did release this idea of kind of the enterprise gray annex, and it was definitely the first step to get there, because this is really what was allowing you to start to carry multiple capability packages through a common gray infrastructure. But the next logical step to this, again, is for one of the enterprises, whether it's Netcom, whether it's DISA, whatever the case may be, to deploy a gray network that, like I said, supports multi-tenant type capabilities. The next big logical step here, I think, is CSfC enablement of the IL6 clouds. One of the things that when we talk a lot to some of the folks is, how do we get more cloud adoption? How do we get more cloud adoption? And the shorter answer is you're not going to get cloud adoption unless you have cloud access, right? And that cloud access can be done in multiple formats to help improve the force across different things. So one of the examples we often give is using something like Amazon Workspaces or Azure RDV to allow you to enable the FSI community to do development, as an example, directly in the IL6 cloud, using kind of that force. Why do I have to move my developers into a skiff or onto a base every time just to develop an application or a capability inside of the IL6 environments? Another example of this is we talk about AI and ML and using all these capabilities that kind of live inside the cloud. Well, how do you get the data from the edge back to the cloud today, right? Specifically into the IL6 cloud. And depending who you talk to, you're going to get a different answer. But with the way that the cloud is structured and the way that you have the ability to automate and orchestrate and deploy capabilities, it makes sense to be able to tie your edge node capabilities directly back into the IL6 environments and either minimize the data that transports and allows the transaction to happen inside of the cloud, or use your application to kind of leave it at the edge, right? And the final piece to this is, we talk a lot about, as I mentioned before, a lot of the use cases that we deploy are deployed around kind of this concept of using thin clients on the workstation. And every time I have to go to a customer and I go, hey, how many simultaneous VDI sessions are you going to need as part of this solution? And they give me some number that's 1,500, 2,000, whatever the case may be. The team has to go and build them an entire VDI stack to support those users. And we all know very few times has there ever been 2,000 simultaneous sessions going in, right? Using something like a cloud model, again, something like Workspaces or RDV, giving you the ability to essentially pay for only what you're using for versus having to put that big CapEx cost in just to have a VDI infrastructure that you're probably only going to use 10, 15, 20% of anyway. The last slide before I kind of open it up for questions is that this is, again, kind of my belief and kind of one of the core tenets that I truly believe in, is that the idea of having a common network from the accredited cloud all the way to the edge and to the end user. And I'm using edge and end user here with the definition of whatever you define that as, okay? But I believe that in order to keep up with what's going on in industry today with regards to development and innovation, that the CSfC community has the ability to tie the systems together using the different CPs in ways that enable not just, this concept of a unified network, but also actually bringing and accelerating new capabilities, to where they need to be at. That's all I have as far as kind of specific slides and kind of talking points. I wanted to take a couple minutes, open it up to the group, see if anybody's got any questions or thoughts, or tell me I'm stupid. I'm down with all of it. So. Yeah, I mean, so a very little bit of my background real quick. Oh, so the question was how could this solution have helped me when I was still on active duty? I spent some time acting as kind of the senior engineer in the soft community, and one of the things that just happened to me all the time is nodes go down, systems go down, and I would have to jump in the car in the middle of the night, drive 40 minutes, go into the office, fix a problem sometimes that would take 1 or 2 minutes to fix. Having the ability to remotely connect from somewhere like my house or from some appropriate facility that may not be my house, but not necessarily have to drive the 40 minutes, unlock the skiff, sit down at my desk, boot up my machine, kind of go through that whole process every time. Not only would it help me and help the warfighter and solve problems quicker, honestly, it would have made me just a happier person. Because there's a couple people in here right now that can speak to this as well. Driving into the office 3-4 times a night sometimes isn't always the best for your personal life. So. That's probably the easy answer. There's probably a multitude of examples that we could run through outside of that, but that's probably the first one that comes to mind. Got my. Yeah, so the question for those that didn't hear was how could CSfC help with cloud adoption in general? I'm not a cloud expert. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have all the answers for building workloads and migrating them from lower to higher and all those things. But what I do know is in order to get somebody to use something, they have to have access to it. And the process today to get access to the IL6 cloud environments, if you're not in very specific locations, is challenging to do. And it's not a knock on anybody that's doing it. It's just that with regards to the NSA, the CSfC PMO office, there's not even a capability package that exists today that talks about how do I tie directly back into the cloud. So it's on thought leaders that kind of live in this space, from not only the cloud community and the developer community and the FSI community, but from those of us that do CSfC kind of for a living. And there's a multitude of TIs that are out there that do this for a living. And we all have good thoughts and we all have good opinions on how to help enable access to those environments. And whether it's, again, if we're going to go pay one of these FSIs a bunch of money to develop an application, getting them access and giving them the capabilities to do that directly in the environment that it's going to operate in, I think benefits kind of everybody. What you got, Sean? My short answer, Sean, is you'll have to ask the NSA's PMO office. Yeah, no. Yeah, so, and again, this is Mike Maice's belief. I do not speak for the NSA, and I don't even speak for, honestly, the government at this stage. But what I do believe is that the NSA PMO office is invested in helping this program become more and more successful. I think in order to get them to make drastic changes to capability packages or create new capability packages, a demand signal from the force is required to really help do that. And you can come into the PMO's office. You can bring the 500-pound gorillas and the Amazons and the Microsofts as an example, or the Cisco's, whoever the case may be is. But in order to get them to kind of open up to a new capability or a new technology, it's going to take kind of a forward-leaning organization to say, hey, look, this is a requirement for our organization, and we're willing to kind of walk the process with you to get to a viable solution that you're comfortable with, that enables my teams and my soldiers to do these type of things. So I don't think they're against it. They're busy. They're getting thrown capability packages every day. But I think in order to get there in a rapid pace, it's going to take a teamwork from not just one vendor, multiple vendors, the force, the thought leaders who are out there, senior leadership to kind of justify that. Anything else? Sweet. So just to kind of close it out, the slide deck is going to be available. I think the show is going to have it out there. I'm going to be located in booth 211 pretty much the rest of the week or the next 2 days. If you have questions, thoughts, please stop by. If you want to, like I said, if you want to tell me I'm an idiot, I'm okay with that too, because both types of feedbacks provide value from kind of the product development loop. So. With that being said, I appreciate everybody's time. Thank y'all for coming by, and thank you guys for everything you do.